Hirshberg. I want to thank our partners for their support of today's program, the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, and DLECTRICITY, Detroit's nighttime exhibition of art and light, and our series partners, Arts at Michigan and Michigan Radio 91.7 FM. Few announcements before we get started today. As hopefully you noticed on your way into the theater, we have voter registration in the lobby today. If you're not registered, get registered and then get informed, because your turn to have a voice is coming up November 6th. Your deadline to get registered to vote in Michigan is October 9th. I think that's next Tuesday, so do it. I have a special welcome to someone somewhere in our midst today. I don't know. I know he's here, though. Paul Kaiser of the Open-Ended Group has just flown in today. He's arrived from New York. He's going to be with us for a while over the next sort of 9 months or so, back and forth, with his compadres in the Open-Ended Group. He and his fellow Open-Ended Groupers are the WIT Artist in Residence this year at the School of Art and Design. Yeah. They are here pursuing a very ambitious project in the city of Detroit, currently titled Detroit, A Line Through Lives and Places. They're going to be creating an experimental hybrid digital documentary map through the Brush Street corridor of Detroit. This is going to offer new ways of looking at public and private space in time and space, present, past, maybe future. So they're eager to collaborate with students in the school here at the University of Michigan, in the community of Detroit, Ann Arbor. So if you want to get involved and find out more, on Monday there will be a presentation at 2 o'clock in the Ehrlicher Room in the North Quad building. So you should show up. Mark Downey, Paul's partner, will also be here for that. And then this weekend, don't miss it, don't miss it. DLECTRICITY, Friday and Saturday night in Detroit, the new nighttime contemporary light art festival hosting 35 local, national, and international artists, including School of Art and Design's own John Marshall and Melanie Manos. These cutting-edge projections and installations will illuminate the historic Midtown Detroit corridor. So plan a promenade along Woodward and take in Detroit's first Nuit Blanche. And this will be happening concurrently with Paris and New York. Everything you need to know is at that's DLECTRICITY.com, DLECTRICITY. And of course, join us here next week for Korean web artists, Heavy Industries, same time, same place. And now, there will be a Q&A today. Please join us directly afterwards if you want to meet Peter and ask him some questions. As usual, we will be down in the screening room directly following his stage presentation. For a little background on Peter before he comes out, Peter Hirshberg, he's a Silicon Valley executive. He's at the forefront of disruptive change in technology and media. At some point, I asked Peter how he would describe himself a number of months ago when we were doing marketing materials, and his answer was applied McLuhanist. He is that indeed. He is chairman of the Reimagine Group, which helps clients anticipate the digital era, how it will revolutionize relationships between people, places, brands, and government. He works with high-level executives at Best Buy, Hertz, Sony, Unilever, Thomson Reuters, IBM, Verizon, GE, Telefonica, and more. He's also chairman and co-founder of San Francisco's Gray Area Foundation for the Arts, or GAFTA. He's led successful initiatives to bring urban innovation, smart city applications to the global stage. He's at the forefront of an urban prototyping movement, which envisions opportunities for connecting people and place. He's pioneered civic innovation programs in San Francisco and Singapore. He's addressed the UN General Assembly on the application of big data to global economic development. And he is now creating new media, art, and data properties exploring how digital, design, art, technology can serve as tools for civic participation. He's a senior fellow at the USC Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership, a Henry Crown Fellow at the Aspen Institute, and a trustee of the Computer History Museum. He is co-author of a forthcoming book, The Citizen, the Cloud, and the Smart City, and editor of Taking the Global Pulse. Please join me in welcoming Peter Hirshberg.
Hello. I am thrilled to be here in Detroit for DLECTRICITY. When Christina invited me, it struck me as one of the most innovative things that are going on, and it's really part of a global trend as downtown cores are doing some of the most amazing things with kind of old bones and incredibly new ideas. And this is lead among them. And this is a global movement. I mean, as you know, DLECTRICITY is going on here and in New York and in Paris. I was in San Francisco yesterday at the Code for America Summit with the mayor of Philadelphia. He said, we're doing something similar to permanently in our downtown core. In San Francisco, we've been looking at doing this. And so there's something going on here with creativity going on in cities, and some mix between the innovation economy, kind of traditional entrepreneurism that everybody wants, civic innovation, which is how all of this stuff starts to change the way we relate to government and participate in the city in a very profound way, and also the arts. And that's a bit about what I want to explore with you. I've spent a career in the tech industry in various platforms. I was at Apple for many years when we were trying to figure out how to market the personal computer. I started a couple of early internet companies when we were figuring out how is that as a platform, and I was chairman of one of the first search engines in the blogosphere and social media. And yet I realize it's all kind of leading towards the city as a platform, as programmable and as malleable and as accessible as, say, the iOS operating system is or Linux is. And when you think of cities and architecture being that open, that's a real change. I've learned a lot about what we're going to share with you tonight at Gray Area Foundation for the Arts. Now, in San Francisco, we started this, my partner Josette Melcher and I, about 5 years ago, because we realized we were like the tech center, and there was this really interesting dialogue going on between artists and the technology world. Artists were learning about open source, they were building new forms of projects, but there wasn't kind of a clubhouse for all of this. And so we created Gray Area Foundation. That's our homepage, and as you can see, we have an urban prototyping festival right now. We're teaching a bunch of really interesting stuff. And we've had an amazing community come by. So we've done projects with the MIT Sensible Cities Lab, and yet also with Burning Man. And we've had this amazing community of coders and makers and designers, and it's really from all of them that I've learned kind of a lot of this and a lot of that I'm going to share with you. You know, to start off with, cities have always reflected their technology, and that has always kind of influenced the art. If we go back about 100 years to the artist Joseph Stella, who came to New York, now he was a futurist, and they were kind of violently opposed to traditional art. And this was one of his iconic works, and this was the Brooklyn Bridge, which was exciting and new and vibrant, and it was foretelling kind of a force of energy in the city. And so this was an example of 100 years ago of this jazz that was going on between art and cities, and it was unimaginably exciting. In fact, we're gathering today on nearly the 100th anniversary, just a few months off of that first transcendent moment in urban lighting. And it's worth remembering what an effect this technology had on people, because in many ways we're there again. On April 23rd, 1913, President Wilson flipped a switch in the White House. And in New York, a couple hundred miles away, the Woolworth Building, the then tallest building in the world, lit up with 80,000 bulbs blazing on. Now, Rick Burns tells the story in his amazing documentary on New York. One observer at the time said, it looked like an immense fireball, giving the effect of a gorgeous jewel resplendent in its setting of rich gold, visible to mariners nearly 40 miles out to sea. It was called the Cathedral of Commerce at the time, and it captured the energy and the excitement and the exuberance going on in cities back then. If we think about the technology in our era, the excitement that we have in cities, the resurgence of cities today, almost wasn't to be. In the 1990s, as the personal computer was coming out, in the early days of the web, and also kind of at the tail end of the growth of suburbanism, it was supposed that cities would be obsolete. That in a world of connected people, who would actually have to be downtown hanging out with other people creatively where we could go anywhere? The futurist George Gilder predicted this in 1995 when he said, we are headed for the death of cities due to the continued growth of the personal computer and the distributed organizations advances that cities are becoming leftover baggage from the industrial era. And so it was somewhat of a surprise to find out that actually, by 2008, we hit an incredible milestone where, for the first time in history, more than half of the world's population, 3 billion, are now living in cities. And suddenly, cities are the most interesting administrative unit in the world. The mayors are executives who get things done. The most interesting creative work is going done. If you read the literature, people like Richard Florida show that as kind of young people move in and new ideas flourish, that gives cities real economic advantages. And in addition to that going on, it turns out the defining piece of technology now, if steel and radio and such were the defining technologies 100 years ago, it turns out to be not just the internet, but data. The fact is that all of us are giving off tons of data. There will be more raw data created this year than in all of human history. Each of you is a sensor transmitting your GPS data. The problem that Apple had with its maps last week highlighted how important and how much we rely on these things and how much we're giving off all of this data. So it's not just social media and accessing the web. It is the fact that every part of our built world is being instrumented, giving off data and telling stories, and that lets us, in fact, access the artistic side of cities, the management side of cities, and it turns out the way we can build and contribute to them in ways that were never thought of before. It's often said that we're approaching a world of the Internet of Things, where not just our devices and our machines are on computers, but soon our cars, appliances, cameras, pipelines, roads, bikes, our real plants, and as well as our industrial plants, kind of all of the stuff of the world that we live in. To give you a sense for this, one of the first projects that really captured this happened in Rome in 2006 during the World Cup finals between Italy and France. Now, MIT and Telecom Italia anonymously mapped all the text messages and calls that came in during that tournament. So it was the first time in history that mobile phone data was used as a proxy to show how people were reacting in real time, and you can see that here. So it was the end of normal time. There were first 15 minutes of overtime. There was another 15 minutes of overtime. And then Zidane gets the red card, and as you'll see, suddenly all of Italy goes crazy. This enormous digital signal spike, and the World Cup ends. And what it shows is there's actually this channel that shows how we are reacting and what we're doing in cities. And it turns out it's not just from our ambient devices like phones. The kinds of things that we're building in our world are beginning to change. This is a project, there we go. This is a project that was introduced at the Climate Summit in 2009 by the MIT Sensible City Lab, and I was privileged to work with them to introduce this. So this is a hybrid bicycle wheel. So that's a bicycle wheel, and it gathers energy. So if you go downhill, it gathers up energy. If you're going uphill, it gives you a boost. But in addition to that, it contains wireless sensors that puts kind of all of its riders on a network, and it gathers climate data, traffic data, even social media data. So you think about cars being on a network, bicycles as well.
Welcome to the Copenhagen Wheel, the wheel that turns your ordinary bike into a smart electric hybrid. Quickly and easily, with no additional batteries or wires. The Copenhagen Wheel allows you to capture the energy dissipated while braking and cycling, and save it for when you need a bit of a boost. Controlled through your smartphone, the Copenhagen Wheel becomes a natural extension of your everyday life. The Copenhagen Wheel is your personal trainer, sensing your effort level and providing you with real-time feedback about your fitness and exercise goals. The Copenhagen Wheel also enhances your experience of the city. It connects you with things a cyclist wants to know: upcoming traffic congestion, road conditions, and pollution levels. Choose to keep your data, or share it with your friends and other cyclists through social networks like Facebook. As you ride, you also collect green miles. It's similar to a frequent flyer program, but good for the environment. Elegant, responsive, smart. A new mode of transport for a rapidly changing world.
This was built.
So turn on your life and turn on the city. The Copenhagen Wheel.
This was built by MIT with Copenhagen and working with Italy, and the problem that they were solving is that Copenhagen already had lots of people using bicycles, and the city wanted even more to do, even more so. So this was a way of a digital intervention, really using the same gamification techniques, reward techniques that we see in Facebook, when you get more friends or someone gives you a gift, to give you incentives, to keep track of what you're doing. And what was fascinating was each mayor that I met with had a reason that they thought it would be great for their city. Copenhagen, I think 10% of all of the people who work there worked for the city, so they can give them out. Sydney had just spent a few $100 million on bike paths, and they wanted to populate that. The mayor of a great American city said to me, I want my cops to use bicycles, but some of my cops are pudgy. I need to give them a better reason. And they were all selling themselves. In addition to that, there are built-in sensors. So it turns out that each of these bicycles has a air quality sensor. Copenhagen has 200,000 air quality sensors in the city. For about 50 cents each, you can put air quality sensors in a bicycle and you suddenly get crowdsourced information. So, you know, a few hundred bicycles out there around the whole city, suddenly citizens are contributing much more accurate data than would normally be available. And you kind of get all of this stuff. It also turns out that when we talk about the ability to instrument cities and the role that data plays, there's some things that you don't even expect. And I want to kind of share a couple of these things with you. Here's an example of something that when I first saw it, I thought it was an art project, but it actually reveals something you don't normally think about. That is the guts of a cell phone reduced to a very tiny device, and it was part of a project that was attached to trash and deployed by the Sensible Lab on about 3,000 pieces of garbage. So here you can see that somebody threw out a plastic soap container in Manhattan, and it ended up at the dump somewhere in New Jersey. We don't know a lot about the removal chain. Like, we know how all of our products are made. We could find out where every component comes here. But when you throw something out, we don't really know where it goes. So this was a way of actually watching where do things go? Where do they end up in the city? And how is the city contributing to trash somewhere else? So here is a record of what happened when 2,000 pieces of trash got hooked up with a GPS transmitter and began to tell their story. Now, if you watch this, an awful lot of recycled trash is doing a very ungreen journey. And if you notice, it's almost all the same kind of trash. It's e-trash. It's a cell phone. It's a battery. Over here, that's a printer cartridge that went to Chicago and then flew to the same dump that the other printer cartridge came down with from California. And what this illustrates is, by adding sensors and by learning about cities, we can make things a lot smarter and we can act on them. And this is all part of kind of a general movement that's called smarter cities. And in many cases, this is used to make more optimal cities. Vendors come in and say, we can run traffic better, we can optimize parking, we can do a much better job with crime. And when you hear about smart cities, when you hear about this, you really, you hear about it from a bunch of vendors, and it's really part of a movement. I mean, it's not just top-down stuff from vendors. Across the board, we have a lot of terms for it. I was writing down kind of all of the ways that we talk about the way that we're learning from our environment. But here's the big thing. Oftentimes, this idea is sold the way that big vendors normally sell things. We'll come to your city and for $1 billion, build you something. And I think the big question here is smart cities for whom? Because the internet clearly was built up and all of us get to use it. And it's a pretty open architecture. And the best apps are the ones that people use and build up. And so one of the questions I became really interested in is a smart city something that is done to your city by a big vendor? Or is it something that all of us do collaboratively when we work together? And it really has to do with our vision of how we build the future. Now, historically, the future was always kind of built for us and handed to us. So, for example, At the 1939 World's Fair, famously, General Motors was a big partner in inventing the future, and this was their Futurama, where they kind of rolled out their vision of the suburban future. It was the birth of modern design, of consumer culture, and importantly, the way that our future was handed out back then was you took it sitting down. Like everything else in the industrial era, our role was to be a consumer. Newspapers had readers, NBC had its audience, and we received our future in the GM Futurama sitting down. And this was the way that cities also came to be designed, planned with a great deal of order. They were supposed to also be top-down and planned, and we kind of know how this turns out. We eventually had folks going to the suburbs, urban renewal wasn't, we started to run out of gas, there was an economic crisis, government got poor, we got cranky, especially about government, and now we're all kind of really thinking through and reinventing our cities. And in the world of cities, one of the big questions is, how many people get involved? Can this be created by everybody? And the great urbanist Jane Jacobs, who was famous in New York because she was one of the first people to challenge top-down planning and say stuff should come from neighborhoods, famously said, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. But you might think, how can we create a city by everybody? I mean, someone has to put the building up, we have to decide about neighborhoods. So the normal way we include people is like, there's a plan and then we get to comment it at the last minute. Except if you were around for the last decade, of course, this was the decade where social media completely changed the nature of newspapers and of brands. And an encyclopedia, the best one, was kind of written by its audience. We learned how to crowdsource, co-create, and collaborate. And as the internet spills out onto our streets and into our world, I think that same social media effect is following. So what I want to share with you today is work that we call urban prototyping, which is really a movement, which is the way that lots of people can get involved in using these techniques, actually build solutions, and start feeding back on government. I actually think that the government officials and architects are kind of in the role that editors were 10 years ago. They're suddenly learning that through participation, their world will change and become a lot more collaborative. Let me tell you how this started for me. In the Bay Area, in San Francisco, a few years ago, we opened up our data. The city started publishing where crimes were, traffic information. This is in Oakland, and Oakland opened up its crime data, and citizens noticed that the crime of prostitution was happening once a month from north to south in San Pablo Avenue. And looking at this map, they went to the police and they go, really? The crime isn't committed that way. That's lazy police work. We can see from the data that only police people behave this way because prostitutes are kind of out there more than once a month. Well, the police, it basically worked. The police changed their policing behavior, and very quickly that feedback loop changed to a new change in government. In Fukushima last year, after the nuclear disaster, the government couldn't or wouldn't monitor the radiation. And an open source movement started to put radiation monitors in people's hands, and it was kind of housewives like this one who became part of a network that then had real accurate data that then led to real changes in Fukushima. At our organization, at the Gray Area Foundation for the Arts, one of our very first exhibits was based on open crime data. So you can see this is a plexi display, that's downtown, you can see Market Street there, and right where all the dots are, that's where our organization is, that's where the gallery is, and that's where all the crime is. And I was completely worried. If we put an exhibit up that shows that all the crime is here, all the neighbors will think we're just pointing out that it's a high crime area and we'll get yelled at. So even though I was philosophically in favor of open data and sharing, I was convinced we'd get yelled at. Well, it turns out the opposite was the case. The police showed up, saw this display, and said, finally, people are paying attention. And the Tenderloin, this part of town, is where there are the most single-parent families. And the parents were completely happy that people were paying attention. And this led to a movement that we call Civic Hackathons, which are basically people coming together, designers, developers, technologists, working with the resources that are available, initially city open data, and building applications that can start improving the city. Here's one that a group did all on its own. It's a very noisy part of town, the Tenderloin, but how are you going to prove it? So a team went out and put sensors, without anyone's permission, just put sensors up on the wall, wireless things, kept track of the noise, and we built our own noise map. And then we went to the city and to the Planning Commission, and we go, we now know how much noise is where and what's exceeding the levels, and we suddenly got conversations going around enforcement. So This was like citizens using the techniques learned on social media to start feeding back in the city. I got completely excited about this. I went to City Hall. I talked to our supervisors, our kind of council members. I said, aren't you excited about apps and open data? And they looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I realized that I was like this IT guy talking to the business user, and they didn't understand, or like I wasn't communicating. I had enthusiastic data syndrome. And so I realized the next thing we needed to do is make this relevant to government and to people who are in the city. So we ran a project last summer. We had a race, 11 people running for mayor. And we had them become part of teams, along with developers and people who were kind of into helping the city. And they worked together, building out apps, working together. And so we then had 30 teams building things. We were working with public officials and with the bureaucracy. And this started to change the culture of the city because suddenly more people had their hand on the wheel of what the city was, as opposed to just complaining to City Hall, they got involved. Here's a record of what happened just about a year ago.
Facebook and Twitter, they have an ecosystem. We're trying to build that same platform for government. Hopefully we're developing an urban operating system.
And we kind of realized there needed to be a dialogue between people out to do interesting things and folks who are running the city.
When you're looking at civic applications, think, what is the one thing you want people to do, and design your application around that.
The answers are not all technology, they're not all about data. Some of them are about marketing and about advocacy and about art and about inspiration. And bringing people from different disciplines together is how we're actually going to solve tough problems in the city.
We have the tools to bring people together in brand new ways.
The very fact that so many people are involved is just an amazing testament to what we're up to, and it's cool that we've got the city looking at us. So a really interesting thing happens when you're suddenly pouring a bunch of ideas out during a campaign and you have the candidates involved. They all start stealing each other's ideas. And suddenly, all of us that were kind of coming up with these things were suddenly influencing new ideas that the cities were coming up with. I actually hit on this because a friend was running for mayor and she kept complaining that this other candidate kept stealing her ideas. She put it up on a website and it was on his website the next day. So I'm like, if we actually become a font of ideas and develop them and share them, we'll start to kind of speed up innovation in a city. This works so well that we kind of gave it a name. And here's an interview with one of the guys running for mayor telling me, exactly, this is how we come up with our ideas.
When you are in a campaign, you are constantly looking to push the envelope and to challenge yourself as well as the city, and you're looking for innovative ideas. So in a campaign, it's almost like you're having it's like policy entrepreneurship. And so candidates, especially for those of us who are running for offices that we haven't held, you're looking to identify issues that you can champion and also to work on. And so I think there's a lot of policy entrepreneurship happening in this campaign.
I love the word policy entrepreneurship as a surrogate for, feed up the ideas and we'll go run with them. So here's what happened. We had about 500 participants, 10,000 hours contributed. Importantly, when movements like this are done, what is amazing is the talent around the table. So you have, of course, hardware and software types. Journalists are really important because this is about telling a story and engaging people, and also data journalists that can tell stories with data. Designers, because you have to be, if you're building something, you have to put yourself in the shoes of who you're talking to. Activists, candidates, bureaucrats, very important. It turns out in a city, the guy who works for the transportation department that no one really listens to that much, or the budget doesn't let his idea get taken on. If they come to an event and in 48 hours get to build a prototype, they're galvanized. So here's a couple of examples of things that came up with. Our head of public works told us that wherever he sees public art, he doesn't see graffiti. And where he sees graffiti, he doesn't see public art. And if you're a software developer, you hear this as a dating app between artists and building owners. Basically, supply and demand. So this thing got built out as an application called ArtHere. It was originally built out as a go put murals on it, but there's friction and permits needed in murals. So the city of San Jose, or an arts organization down there, 01 picked it up, and they basically had, between landlords and between people who are doing projection and light art. So kind of think of what's going on in DLECTRICITY, but as in an open source platform where a whole bunch of small projects can come up and continually be put on the city, turning the city into a canvas. And because this is a replicable open source project, it's now moving on to San Jose and San Francisco, and Los Angeles is interested in it. So that came out of a weekend, got fleshed out, and it's actually solving a city problem, and it makes more art. Here's another interesting case. We have a lot of open transit data in San Francisco. Just as in Detroit, there's bus data that's out there. So if you're a consumer, you can get an iPhone app and find out where all the buses are. It turns out if you work for the bus department, you have to carry a clipboard and have a radio, because that very same data is not available if, say, the bus breaks down or a door breaks or there's a crash or something. They don't have a back-end system that can tap into that and communicate it. So an intern from the bus department came and said, this is crazy, we don't have the right tools, formed the team. They went to an operations center, and the operations guy said, well, the city says it'll get to it within 5 years. And in a weekend, they kind of prototyped an iPad app. Looks something like this. So that's the bus data, and as you can see, there's a problem here. Tell the driver that the door is not closing, and he can enter information. So this thing got prototyped, and the paper wrote it up, and it basically said, developers build something in a weekend that the city says it'll have by 2016. The head of the transit department wasn't sure if he should be thrilled because it was innovation, or unhappy because it looked like he was a little behind. But here's what happened. We had a debate among all the candidates, and every candidate running said, this is great, we're going to do this if I get elected. And then Ed Lee got elected, and it was about 8 months later. And you know how government is. This is a new idea. Everything I'm talking about tonight is a little bit new if you're in government. So exactly how you work with this form of citizen engagement wasn't certain. So it did take kind of a traditional nudge. In this case, an investigative piece from the New York Times that 9 months later said San Francisco, kind of innovation capital of the nation, can't quite figure out how to get the innovation done. It took about a week for the city to solve the problem after this. Basically, a foundation or a group called SF City that's doing a lot of great work between the tech sector and the city was able to fund it. The actual team that did this moved in, so basically now all of these innovators were embedded with the transit agency, and not only did they build it, but when it finally came out, that team is actually being heralded as kind of the answer to a lot of the delays and the problems in the system. So this is an example of how a city begins to learn and work with a new resource in what's initially an unnatural act, but San Francisco will tell you it can't possibly have a monopoly on ideas because it's the government, and by its nature, I mean, it is a monopoly, so it needs lots of other people to kind of hear in. This worked very well also because we had all the candidates sharing and debating this kind of stuff. Now, if you think about it, San Francisco culture is famous for activism and engagement. It's kind of our brand. But the difference is that in the 1960s, kind of the idea was to protest the establishment, and today one can actually write to its API. If you're not a coder, an API or an application program interface is the way that anybody can go get at Google or go get at other data. And the point is, the city is increasingly becoming a platform. As it exposes what it does, people can grab on, build, and change it. So soon after this happened in San Francisco, it was kind of clear you could pull this off in a place like San Francisco. And the question is, well, like, would everyone do this? We got a call from Singapore, which is about as top-down a government as there is. And they said, we'd like to do this. And what was amazing, and nobody knew if this would work, and what was amazing is that in a government where for 40 years, you know, people have been told to kind of not have too many ideas, the government's going to run things, we actually had a similar kind of turnout, and Singapore one-upped us further. A lot of the data that you see used in these apps is government data. Singapore figured out how to open up private data. So you remember I showed you early on that cell phone data has all of this, like, it's the fundamental record of where people are in a city. And if you can use that anonymously, you can do transit planning and you can do retail planning. I mean, it basically is the DNA of a city. Another way of looking at this is kind of the public data sits up top and private companies have all this really rich stuff underneath. The team in Singapore figured out how to make all of this stuff available. Now, it turns out in the US or in Europe, we're so worried about privacy, and then companies are so protective of proprietary rights that a lot of this stuff that I think can do great public good is not necessarily available. But a contract was written, and then we opened up about 30 sets of local data, like carrier data, transportation data, energy data, and then citizens started participating even further. So one big issue in Singapore is parking. And it turns out that if you release 1 million parking records, you can start to predict, using big data techniques to predict when a parking spot runs out. And this is one of the apps that got built in a weekend that's now actually being turned into a company.
We want to introduce you to SurePark, the app that tells you where to find available parking. And you know what the cool part is? That you can book a spot when you're nearby.
We created this amazing app during the Up Singapore weekend.
You see, we had access to this amazing dataset provided by Metro Parking, 1 year of real-time availability of parking lots. And you know what we did? We crunched the numbers, build what we call a predictive analytics model.
We can tell you the chances of getting a parking spot at any time of the day, minute by minute, hour by hour. Then, when you're close by, we can book the spot for you, reducing the number of parking lots sitting empty.
At SurePark, we guarantee you a spot. No more being late, no more hassle. SurePark, parking assured.
SurePark, parking assured!
We made every team make a little video. Here's another interesting thing. All of this taxi data was released. And then an analysis was done on it, and they found that about 20% of all taxi rides went to the same places within about 10 minutes of each other. And 5 teams started working on, could we share taxis? Was there a way to either inform drivers how to pick people up or turn taxis into a collaborative resource? One of the big trends these days is collaborative consumption. You know, Airbnb turns your house into a resource when people come to town and stay. Zipcar turns a car from something you own to something you rent. And in the transportation world, being able to instrument these things and turn either private cars or taxis into shared vehicles is a big potential reducer of sprawl and the biggest transit resource we have that's out there, and basically out there at kind of no expense. And so 5 apps got built there. The other thing we did is at a big cities conference, this was an exhibit that, if you go to a big cities conference, you have all these vendors like IBM and Siemens, $1 billion, here's a solution we can do for you. So with the government of Singapore, we showed up with an exhibit that said, and here's what citizens can build themselves and feed back into the city, which is kind of great because it's like a complete impedance mismatch inside of a big conference to suggest that a citizen movement is a peer of kind of what companies do, except if we've learned anything from social media, it fits in there architecturally right along with that stuff. And it didn't hurt if the Prime Minister came by looking at all this stuff. So you may be thinking, since I've described San Francisco and Singapore, this works in like big, rich cities. But it turns out that because so many people across the globe have cell phones and there's so much data, this is making a difference in interesting ways worldwide. Last year, I was doing a project with the United Nations. They had a thing called Global Pulse that's designed to use global information to try to solve interesting problems. So here's an interesting case. When there was the earthquake in Haiti a couple years ago, literally, all the people who do mapping in the city were unfortunately, like literally killed when their building collapsed, and all the maps changed because the roads went away. And that was rewritten kind of in a matter of weeks through people at home, like all of you, looking in on satellite maps, GPS data coming in, and what you're watching is an OpenStreetMap project where people looking at things like Google Maps, so fresh updates to Google Maps and GPS traces from Haiti, rebuilt the map in Haiti in a matter of weeks. Literally, citizens doing that work. It worked so well that they learned that resource so well that a few months later when there was a cholera outbreak, they immediately looked at the cell phone signals and the black areas where cholera was. They saw where people were going. And because they knew where people were going, they knew where cholera was going, and it gave them the ability to actually focus in on and make sure that it wouldn't spread. There are about 4 billion cell phones in the world, and 3 billion of those are in developing countries, which means that developing economies are actually data rich. Nathan Eagle and his colleagues did some research. If you look at how people top up cell phones, so in most of the rest of the world, people don't buy a contract. They pay every little bit as they use their phone. So let's say there's 2 of us, and he spends $10 a month 10 times a month, and she spends $10 all at once. It turns out if you track that kind of behavior and you see how it changes, in real time you can see an economic crisis coming on. So let's say you and I both have a cell phone, and all of a sudden I go from paying $10 once a month to a little bit all throughout the month. I probably have an economic problem coming on. If you look at 20 million people over the course of a month and you see this happening, you can see an economic crisis coming on as it happens. The alternative, by the way, is a year or two later the World Bank will publish a report and tell you that your country collapsed, at which point you've probably been thrown out of office, there's been a riot, and because people went below the poverty line, it's really tough to deal with. So these techniques that we're using in kind of cities in the US have real global applicability. A really interesting way to see this is I think that as a species, we are all developing a form of data literacy that is deeply built in. That is, if you grow up with a cell phone and GPS, you understand there's something existentially important about dots on maps. And a really interesting example of this was a project in India that was part of wiping out polio. And it turns out you have to vaccinate everybody. And they got a bunch of kids who were in their teens to go and put on the maps where houses were so they could go vaccinate them. And they gave the kids GPS devices. Watch what happens with the bunch of kids in India as they start getting a hold of these same techniques I've been talking about tonight.
পাড়ার কোনো ম্যাপ নেই মা বলছে তুই জানিস ম্যাপ নেই সব জায়গার থেকে তোরও পাড়া আছে আমি যে না দেখো মা তো তখন দাদাকে জিজ্ঞেস করেছিলাম ম্যাপ আছে কি তো দাদা গুগল ঘেটে পেল যে না
তো দেখা গেল ফাঁকা কিচ্ছু নেই এটা যে করছে বাচ্চারা নিজেদেরকে ভিজিবল করে তোলার জন্য যে আমি যদি একজন লিগ্যাল সিটিজেন হই আমার দরকার যে আমার ম্যাপটা সারা পৃথিবীর ম্যাপের সঙ্গে থাকবে
আমার এটা ভালো লাগলো যে কোনদিন পাড়াকে মানে হেঁটে যতটা দেখেছি পাশ দিয়ে কিন্তু এটার সাথে সাথে পাড়াকে একবার উপর থেকে দেখছি
এলাকার কোনো বাড়ি নাম্বার নেই কিংবা ব্লকও নেই তো আমরা তারপর ঠিক করলাম যে আমরাও যদি এরকম পুরো এলাকাটা একটা নাম্বারিং করে দিই আমাদের কাজ করতে অনেক সুবিধা হয়ে যাবে প্রথমে যেটা বলছি মানে আগে আমরা যদি পোলিও অ্যাওয়ারনেস করতে যেতাম তাহলে কি প্রত্যেকটা বাড়িতে যেতে হতো আমার এলাকার প্রত্যেকটা বাড়িতে যেটা সত্যি কথা বলতে যে অনেক সময় ওটা খারাপও হয়ে যেত যে এই বাড়িটা মিসিং হয়ে গেল কিংবা এই বাড়িটা হলো না
আর এই মোবাইলটা একটা জিপিএস বলে একটা রেকর্ড লোকেশন আছে যেখানে ডাইরেক্ট আমি যখন ওই রেকর্ড লোকেশনটা নেব ডাইরেক্ট ইন্টারনেটে চলে যাবে
So to me, that's a form of literacy that they kind of innately know that if they're missing on a map, they don't exist. And I think what I'm seeing is that kind of around the world, whether it's in Detroit or in New York or in the UN project that we were doing, which was in Kampala and in Indonesia or here, the teams of people around the world who kind of get this stuff and they have more in common with each other than perhaps the people they're with every day, that's a really interesting force for change. So far, a lot of what we've discussed happens at kind of the information layer in a city. The next question is, well, what about the physical city itself? How do we start affecting that? That's kind of a movement that's largely called tactical urbanism. And basically it says that the lack of resources is no longer an excuse not to act. The idea that you have to take an action after there's planning and you do a lot of question and answers is a sure recipe for paralysis. In fact, the planning of a city is a process that has to go on in real time. It shouldn't be delegated to a room and then slowly done. This is really an ethic of the web. If you think about it, people who grow up with the web, they like less meetings, like to get more stuff done. On the web, we try things, and if they don't work, we try them again, as opposed to a city that if you get something wrong, you're in a lot of trouble and you get thrown out of office. So one of the projects we've done in this is something we did with American Express called creative currency. We took a part of town that was an evolving, difficult part of town. So the Tenderloin has in it lots of people who are in the informal economy. They're not part of the cash, they're part of the cash economy because they don't have credit, they may be out of work, many may be homeless. We noticed that at the very same time we're looking at that population, a lot of the entrepreneurs in San Francisco are working on new forms of currency and exchange. I mean, after all, Airbnb and Shareable and all those things are about sharing things, but not necessarily with the cash economy. And American Express came in and helped support this. So here's an example of the kind of things that are possible when you pilot things and you want to improve a neighborhood. Here is Central Market Street, where we're located. this was thriving in the 1940s, back when we had, I mean, like in World War II, there were lots of ship workers. It was a thriving economy down there. And then afterwards, a lot of people left that part of San Francisco, and it kind of fell into a lot of decline. And this was a part of town that was having real trouble coming back. And so there's a big chicken-egg problem here. No one's going to put a restaurant there if people don't show up. So what this project did is they said, what if we use pop-ups? So if you know what a pop-up is, right? It's a restaurant that pops up, or it's a food truck, or it's a store that comes briefly. What if we could organize all those pop-ups so they all happened at once? And then we built an online system where landlords could rent out their first floor space for that activity. Turns out if you're a landlord, first floor is tougher to rent, isn't as productive as upstairs, so stuff stays boarded up. And then you could also pay local people who may be out of work. So the idea is, could we shock the system into kind of prototyping what a vibrant economy would look like? And then if we showed what it was looking like working, real estate developers and entrepreneurs might actually invest in the whole thing. So that thing was built, and here's a little clip of when it was deployed. So I want to share with you a little bit about the process and what we learned. You know, the first stuff I shared with you tonight was done in a hackathon. So people came together for 48 hours, built something. They generally started on Friday night, and on Sunday night they showed something. The problem with that way of doing things is people are all excited, and there's a little prototype built, but does it scale? For this one, we did research ahead of time to really understand community problems. People came in, and then we selected 4 projects and incubated them. We gave them about 6 months, and then they reported back what they came up with. That was one of them. Forbes, of all people, the capitalist tool, wrote an article about it. There was another project called Trust Score. So if you're out of work or you're new to a community, you don't have a credit score. If you don't have a credit score, you can't get a job, you can't rent someplace, which means you're unlikely to have a job, so you're much more likely to not be in the economy. Another one of these chicken-egg problems. So then this took a look at, were there other surrogates that would actually predict that you'd be trustworthy? Your behavior with others, working with other people who are trustworthy. So beginning to use the same web technology we use to solve other problems to serve this community. There was another project that turns out if you're a homeless person in San Francisco, it's a full-time job. You spend all day looking for shelter and then all day trying to get some medical attention for your kid. You're basically not part of the economy. And so they looked at, could they build a reservation system for that? And it's been leading to a lot of really interesting innovation. The next area that we became really interested in is actually building out physical things in a city. So everything I've talked about so far happens like with information technology, and yet we live in physical space, and that's how you excite people. And it turns out one of the real problems with physical space is you need permits, and it can be difficult. So the current Urban Prototyping Festival, which is going on in San Francisco right now and is moving on to Boston and London as well, is focused on 3 things: digital and physical, open source and documented, replicable and affordable. So now, you know, this has kind of gone from the data layer into how do we actually start feeding back in cities. And then eventually we're going to get to art and all the stuff that's going on right here, right now. So here is this similar part of town. This is the 5M project. This used to be the Chronicle headquarters. We had 2 great newspapers in San Francisco, and then it kind of collapsed down to a bit of one newspaper. And all of the space that they were in has actually become space for innovation. So like startups have moved in there, and the people the Hearst people who still own this space have basically said, we believe that if we can build in this space creative uses of it, if we can do creative things in the neighborhood, if we can learn from our community, we'll actually build a better economic space for the kind of economy we're going into than if we just master planned it from the top down. So they went through and they cataloged all the space, and there are 4 acres every alley, every door, kind of, you know, the stuff you'd normally look at and say blight, it's unused, that's not a resource, someone will develop it sometime in the future. And put together an idea book and said, actually, people can do really interesting things. You can create parklets, you can do interesting designs, you can make things more fun and more engaging. And then what we did is we invited the community to apply and to see what they could come up with. And we did this in two ways. We invited a bunch of people, we juried it, we funded a few, and then last weekend we had a make-a-thon. And what's interesting here now is you've got real estate interests saying the community can get involved and we can learn from them. So here's some of the things that people have come up with. And if you come to San Francisco on the 20th, you can come to our big fair in which we're sharing a whole bunch of this and many other things with the city. So, so it turns out in San Francisco, the law says where there's a fire hydrant, you can't park in front of it. But the law does not say it has to be paved. So if you add it all up, there's 10 extra miles of garden in the city that no one is using. So this was, could we make 10 miles of garden out of working with hydrants? If you saw the film Big, you recognize this. This was, could we turn this stairway into a set of sensors so as you go up and down, it makes music and you could interact with it. And these are all projects that are being built right now. This is the darkness map. So we know that darker parts of town often have more crime and people avoid them. And we also walk around with cell phones all the time that have cameras. If you actually read the lightness levels out of cameras in an app across the city, you can get a very accurate map by time of day of how dark it is, and then you can go attack and do various things with it. That's the darkness app. Pulse of the City is putting pulse sensors in various places in the city to literally get the pulse of the city, heart rate, emotion, stuff like that. Of course, the secret is in San Francisco, the top of any hill would have more of that. So while all that was going on, we wondered what could get built in a weekend when people came together. So this is last weekend, about a week ago tonight, and this is everybody sitting around getting ready to go work on stuff. Because we were dealing with the physical part of the city, we had to give people access to the ability to make things. And this is the Instructables lab at Autodesk. This room actually has more 3D printers and laser cutters than any other place in America. They have the most sophisticated facility, and we got access to it. So people were working in it for about 48 hours, and here you can see them building things. This is in San Francisco what we do in our free time, and it's delightful. But importantly, we have a rule when you do all these things. You can't just serve people pizza. So the chef came up from Facebook, and he was making delicious vegetarian stuff. So here's some of the things that came out of that. Again, I was talking about how darkness, you know, you think of an alley that's dark at night. Oftentimes there'll be a street mural. This is a really clever idea. What if you found where there were murals and you did projections so at night those murals lit up? It's kind of like a mini decentralized DLECTRICITY. And this is an example of a mural, and what happens is they then built a video that projects across the street, and when it gets dark, it takes a dark part of town and makes it light and makes it art. And just delightful. It's scalable. It turns out the technology scales. And you can do interesting things. Like you could take this alleyway and make it a forest at night. Or you could take this kind of duct area in a part of town and change its topography. And that was kind of built, prototyped, and deployed in a weekend. Here's another fun one. This was, so you know all of those, like if you go to the Golden Gate Bridge or you go to the Empire State Building or some attraction, that, you know, put money in the binoculars. And it says, it brings distant objects of interest within close range. So they imagined, what if we had things around town that used that piece of technology, but actually showed you different things. So the idea is, you might be looking at a part of town and you could see it in the future, or in the past. Or perhaps you'd be looking at a wall and you'd see DLECTRICITY. And this actually got prototypes. So here you see the people working on it. And what was amazing is the thing showed up on Sunday night completely working. And off to the side there was a little remote control camera. And this is another thing that has been built and will be deployed and being used in the city. And these are all really interesting interventions. Oh, there we go. Okay. if you think about kind of all of this stuff, there's, in addition to kind of this kind of planning, there are tools that now exist that let teams of people actually plan parts of town. This is Betaville, a project out of New York. So if someone's planning a redevelopment in a part of town, typically what happens is the big architecture firm comes in and works with the city. They come up with an idea. The developer works, has an idea, and then it's presented for comment. The citizens get to come in and comment. And unless there's a big hue and cry, not a lot happens. These planning people relate to citizens the way that the newspaper related to citizens 10 or 15 years ago. It's like you could write a letter to the editor or comment, but we really wouldn't trust you to write the news. You didn't really have a story to write. I remember like 8 years ago when I was chairman of Technorati, that was one of the first search engines in blogging, I would go off and I would talk to news editors, and they're like, who the hell are the bloggers, and why should they have anything to say? And what we've now learned is that's completely part of the news economy. And the same is true in a brand, right? You build a brand with your customers. This product allows a designer, an architect, students to use this thing, and it kicks out an AIA-approved RFP, which means it's in the same language that the city planning people use, and so now you can have a conversation at the table. Which is the reason I say that all of these people are kind of in the same set. These are architects, urban planners, editors, brand managers, are people who use skill and their taste to help us design and experience our world. And in the last 10 years, brand managers and editors have completely changed how they work with their audience. They're really not the audience anymore. They're prosumers, they're co-creators, it's collaborative consumption, it's what we think in social media. That's all beginning to come to the architect and urban planning profession. And one of the most interesting things about this is if you go to a planner, they're like, citizens couldn't possibly have anything useful to say. Like, they'd get it wrong, they'd screw it up. And it's correct that that's an important profession to understand, and the reason we have planning was to get around really bad things that were done before. But I think what's happening is as we get this kind of literacy, citizens are contributing first tactically and then in a deeper sense to our cities. Asaf Bitterman, who co-runs the Sensible City Lab at MIT, I was showing him a bunch of these projects. He goes, a lot of these things your people are doing look like what my first-year graduate students do in their second semester. And I'm like, and as soon as they find out that they're doing only first-year work, they'll learn even more. So I think we're building a literacy with how we work with our built environment, just as we built a literacy with math. I remember at Apple many years ago, probably before most of you were born, when we introduced the first laser writer. We were very excited because it could do fonts, lots of fonts. And when we gave this, when we sold this, what happened for the first 2 or 3 years is people did a really lousy job with fonts. They'd use like 8 fonts in a document, it looked like shit, and it was really bad. But like 20 years later, actually, like if you go to school, you learn how to do this stuff. It's like part of the literacies, you kind of learn design. I think we're going to learn the same kind of stuff around cities. So the next thing is the way increasingly we relate to cities today is like this. I mean, we have, this is one of the reasons I'm so excited about DLECTRICITY, is you see people walking around like this, and so and since this is a principal interface, if you're in the design or planning or tech world, this is actually a next big problem. And both how to make this work and how to make the city more responsive. So, for example, here is a part of town, and this is a project that's going on in LA. And the question is, how can we make this device and the city interact more in some augmented way? How do we augment our city so we get the benefit of the digital world and of the physical world? So kind of using this as a surrogate for a QR code, this device can actually read that, and then suddenly you can start projecting information, not in the way perhaps that we're used to in Google Maps or in an app you have to call up, but when your phone sees that and it knows where it is, you can start twirling around and you have an interface where you're playing the city, where you're actually using the architecture as a device, and then on top of that, it can start layering in how to use to and respond to the city. And I think, you can see these different disciplines coming together. We first start to deal with data and we make better services. Now we start to bring it down to the level that all of us live in every day. And this is really beginning to apply the devices we live with to the built environment so that they're in a more harmonious way of working together. And this is This is a pilot project in LA that basically understands how to read these maps, and what it's superimposing on that is something that that map can't do. It's superimposing in real time where the buses are. Finally, let's wrap up and talk about how this affects our world and our built environments themselves. In many ways, this whole movement starts with the easy stuff and then deals with the more substantial or the tougher stuff. The very first apps that I showed you were easy to do. It's easy to do an overlay on the transit system or go build the art project. It's a little tougher to go actually get the city to adopt it. It's easy for anyone to work on the information layer. It's a little tougher to have an agreement about a space or a park. Architecture and our buildings stick around for 75 or 100 years. So what does it mean for architecture to become responsive and to actually communicate the excitement and the exuberance and the liveliness that we see in the world when we walk around like this? So, and this whole thing is kind of called responsive environments. This is a project that's going on in Boston at MIT. So this is simply adding kind of a layer to a building that is programmable and fun and responsive. You can also use these things and apply the principles of gamification. So over here in Helsinki, that's the power station. Now, when everybody conserves a lot of energy and power use goes down, that fun laser projection goes up. It's basically they're projecting lasers in the cloud. It's a basically group collaborative power meter for the city. It's applying gamification. If you drive a Prius, you know that you love to kind of use as little energy as possible. And if you're a game player, you get hooked on your feedback. Most energy feedback is delivered at the house level. You and your kids want to read the electric bill. This is at the city layer, city level. And there are many ways that one can interact and play in the city. One of the projects that Theo Watson did at our part of town in San Francisco is they put a little camera in, and then you got projected across the street. Now, this was a dangerous kind of part of town that people avoided. But the minute this piece of art was put in, where it took your picture and then projected you across the street, it made the whole thing more public. And there was dialogue going on between a lot of people. So you kind of, it's like the homeless community and everyone else generally don't have anything to do with each other. But they'd be lining up and smiling and kind of interacting. So it was an example of kind of how a simple intervention kind of got people doing things. More and more of our space can be used for things that are at once interactive or perhaps instructive or perhaps commercial. So this was an experiment done in Vanderbilt Hall in Grand Central Station in New York. The Financial Times wanted to put up an ad, but what they wanted to communicate was the brand value of financial literacy. So it's basically this financial game, and as you walk around, Kinect-like sensors let you actually go change economic variables, and you can do what-ifs, and you can go play with that. So this became an activity that clearly got people's attention, was using public space, got you away from doing this, and it was a new form of kind of art or advertising, and we found it really inspirational. The Grand Central people are now going to permanently go ahead and find a way to program that space interactively. Philadelphia this month, they have one big project. They don't have as many as we have here with DLECTRICITY, but this project, which is called Open Air, is one in which there's 24 lasers around town, and voice sound modulates them. So kind of think of the visualizer in iTunes. This is like a giant visualizer in the sky. And at times they have the symphony playing, and at times you can use your cell phone and call into an app, and you can play Philadelphia. And that one's going on right now. In New York, this was a piece that was done by Obscura Digital. This is the Guggenheim. For a second. So these are all examples of of interesting forms of collaboration that are going on in cities. In San Francisco, just a few months ago, there was a project that Intel did called the Creators Project that brought about 25,000 people out to a part of town, and they were interacting with music and with these sets of things. And I brought the mayor along. Here's the mayor, and that's the guy who runs technology for the city. And what the mayor took away from this is this form of interaction actually brings people out, kind of is economically good for a city because it creates things to do, and it can be used for storytelling, it can be used for advertising, it can be used for art, it can be used to visualize things in the city. And we began to put a seed in the mayor's mind that maybe this kind of stuff should be a permanent part of our city, that it turns out that this form of creative expression, using the city as a canvas, would actually be an economically good idea for San Francisco, especially because we're supposed to be this big tech city, and if you walk around, our buildings kind of look like everybody else's buildings. This is a piece that it's called The Treachery of Sanctuary, and it was an interactive triptych done by Chris Milk. Oh, is it going to play? Well, anyway, it plays. There are many different media that one can do this stuff in. This is a piece that MIT did using water. So this is called the Digital Water Pavilion. It's the technology of printer cartridges, of inkjet printers, except here what it's jetting out is water, and then with that you can actually start printing out words, doing shapes. The walls of the building are basically water in this case. And this was actually done in Spain in 2008. And it's an example of the richness of things that are possible. I've become a bit concerned that San Francisco, as innovative as we say we are, can sometimes not be that innovative when it comes to doing things in the public space. We're such a progressive town that it turns out we have a lot of people who might object to things and who might be concerned that if you try something new, it might be using space in a wrong way. So I actually feel like San Francisco is a place that is not as advanced, that is not, I mean, if you look at all the stuff that I'm showing you here, stuff's going on around the world. And a bunch of us have been thinking, how do we do this iconic stuff in our city? Because there's a real belief that civic innovation, the kind of new ways of working with government, is a peer of entrepreneurial innovation, economic development, and that this kind of creative stuff is just as important in that mix. So one of the most interesting projects that just went ahead is a project that's going ahead in the Bay Bridge. So I kind of want to wrap up and talk about two things in San Francisco. That's the Bay Bridge. It went up about 75 years ago. And Leo Villarreal, who is an artist who has expressed himself he's been shown around the world, he uses LED art. I got to know Leo at Burning Man, where he would do enormous, wonderful pieces of work on the playa. And he had this dream of what if he could turn the Bay Bridge into a piece of art. Now, you can imagine getting permission from the transportation department to put up lights and program the bridge as a permanent piece of software. That itself is the artwork. But Leo and Ben Davis and a team of people came together, and over the last couple of years actually raised the money to go turn this into a 2-year art project. And literally, they just got the go-ahead 2 weeks ago, and construction's already started. So what I want to share you is a rendition of the Bay Lights, which we hope will become the most iconic example of this form of expression, new form of digital art in our city. And it's due to open, I think, on March 6th. That's the Golden Gate Bridge, for reference. So this is envisioned to be 25,000 light-emitting diodes, and all software programmed. So Leo's going to use, as his influence, data that comes from around that part of town. He writes very sophisticated algorithms, so it's never the same thing. He actually fine-tunes the algorithms from a fireboat out in the bay. So his form of art isn't real-time responsive. It doesn't react to what you do. It reacts the way that he comes up with it as the artist. But I think when this launches, it may galvanize our city. It may communicate to people who may not understand why technology and art belong in the same sentence, that this is an incredibly exuberant way to express our city. And that what's going on in the tech world now, as embodied in San Francisco and here and kind of where these communities exist, is as creatively as important as jazz was. And all of that music was here and in New York and in New Orleans early in the century. It's a very important creative expression of ourselves, and I think we're just beginning to learn to appreciate it. Our former mayor, Gavin Newsom, was talking about this recently, and he was talking about kind of how difficult it is to kind of make something like this happen that's new.
But with all due respect, Paris, eat your heart out. I love the Eiffel Tower, but we got the Bay Bridge. It ain't so bad. And by the way, I was in Paris. I had no idea they lit that thing up, and I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And then I saw this 1-minute video, Leo. I was like, oh, forget about it. How do we make this thing happen? I picked up on the best of Willie Brown, which is, you know, sort of ask for forgiveness, not permission. And so I learned from Mayor Brown, and I decided, forget permanent art in San Francisco. The key is temporary art. See, then you don't have to, you bypass the whole process, and once you put it in, you never have to take it out. So.
Now, this is a really key thing. I've been talking about urban prototyping all night, and the mayor just summarized it. It's like, if you call it a prototype, we're just trying something out, you will impact and affect the city. And we have always used light in a very powerful way in human communications. If you go back 30,000 years ago to the caves, it is surmised that the reason that worked as an amazing Technicolor or gaming experience of the day was the drawings were up there that told a story, the light was flickering around the cave, and there was something amazing or spiritual or holy or uplifting, but important going on right there. And if you took an X-ray view of the cave, you'd see it was kind of a canyon. It was a space that could be programmed. Not unlike, for example, Market Street in San Francisco, which is our next project, and it's the one that we're working on now. We call it the Digital Arts and Entertainment District. And our idea, our hope, and this is what we have a ballot proposition coming up to do, is to take this part of town that's kind of blighted and is beginning to come back and make it a permanent expression of this kind of stuff. So what if we took that part of town and we put up kind of digital skins in various places? So we might have 100 surfaces that we could address as one virtual surface. They might be doing visualizations, they might be talking about data in the city, they might be telling stories, it might be art, there'd probably be local advertising. But the idea is that as you walk down this part of town, we could address the whole thing and make it an ongoing piece of art, or an ongoing way to tell a story, or an ongoing visualization, and make it programmable. And it would be different than, say, what New York does. I mean, New York's brand is ruthlessly, single-mindedly commercial. And when we show this stuff to people, they think Times Square, which is why I'm excited about the Bay Lights. It's an alternative. Our brand is about data, it's about play, it's about stories, art, it's about activism. And I think that's going to be achievable in this art form as an authentic statement of who we are. And it turns out that we used to be this, just as Detroit was a thriving city that's coming back. It's just we've forgotten. 40 years ago, this was Market Street in San Francisco. It's all gone now because that economy went away and people just relate to it like it's a problem. But we think this stuff can be brought back, interpreted in a modern way of today's technology, of today's inclusiveness, and today's excitement. And that's the reason that I was so excited to come out and join you here, because what you guys are doing at DLECTRICITY falls exactly into this narrative of exciting work that's going on in cities, reclaiming cities, people being authors of their cities and not just leaving it to the people in City Hall, in 3 ways: in innovation, in civic innovation, and in this important art and design component. And that's how we're going to be building a better city future for all of us. Thank you very much.